The rain came down like it meant to drown the world. Ivy Callahan had been running for 47 minutes. She knew because she'd been counting, the way her therapist had taught her to count things when panic started swallowing her whole. And the number had stopped comforting her somewhere around minute 30, when the trail markers disappeared and the trees closed in and her phone screen blinked once, twice, and went black and cold in her palm like something dying. She ran anyway. Branches clawed at her face. Underbrush grabbed at her ankles. The forest here was nothing like the manicured parks she jogged through back in Portland, where the paths were lit and labeled and there were always other people. Joggers with dogs, elderly couples walking slowly, teenagers sitting on benches. Other warm human bodies that made the world feel safe. This forest was old. Ancient, almost in a way she could feel in her chest, like it had been here so long it had stopped pretending to be anything other than indifferent to whether she lived or died inside it. She didn't look back. Looking back was how you fell. She knew this the way she knew all the rules of running from something. Don't look back, don't stop moving, don't let yourself think about what's behind you because the moment you think about it, it becomes real in a way it wasn't before. Marcus had taught her that without meaning to. 6 months of learning not to look back. 6 months of learning that the sound of footsteps behind her, real or imagined, it didn't matter, meant only one thing. Move. He heard it again. A crashing. Heavy. Something big moving through the underbrush 30, maybe 40 feet behind her. Off to the left where the darkness was absolute and the rain was a solid curtain of white noise. A deer, she told herself. It's a deer. It's just a deer. There are deer in forests. That's where deer live. She ran harder. Her lungs were burning. She'd been an athlete once. Track 2 years of college cross-country before tuition and reality caught up with her. And her body still remembered the geometry of running, the efficient forward lean, the arms low and loose. But she'd been running for 47 minutes in hiking boots on uneven ground in the dark in the rain. And her legs were past the point of muscle memory and deep into something more primitive, pure animal desperation. The root came out of nowhere. She didn't see it, didn't feel it until her left boot caught the edge of something solid and buried and her momentum did the rest. Her body pitched forward, arms windmilling, nothing to grab, nothing to catch her. And she hit the ground so hard the impact cracked through her like a bell being struck. Her left ankle screamed. She lay there for a moment in the mud and the wet leaves, rain hammering her back, and performed a rapid, desperate inventory. Hands scraped but functional, right knee bruised but bending, ribs aching but probably intact. And her ankle. She already knew without testing it. The pain was the specific nauseating kind that sat behind your eyeballs and told you something had gone structurally, seriously wrong. She tried to stand anyway. Her ankle gave immediately, folding sideways, and she went back down with a sound she was embarrassed by. A short, involuntary cry that disappeared into the rain before it could travel more than 10 feet. She lay still for 3 seconds, breathing through her teeth, and then she tried again. This time she made it to one knee. Transferred her weight slowly, carefully. The ankle held. Barely. It was a white-hot wire running from her foot to her hip, and putting weight on it made black spots bloom at the edges of her vision. But she was standing. She could still. She took one step and her body simply refused. Her knee buckled. She caught herself on the trunk of a nearby tree, hugging it like it was the only solid thing left in the universe, and breathed. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The bark was rough against her cheek. The rain ran down the back of her collar. She was not going to make it out of these woods. The thought arrived without drama, which somehow made it worse. Just a calm, practical assessment from some quiet part of her brain that had been watching the situation for a while now and had reached a conclusion. Dead phone, no trail, injured ankle, temperature dropping, night deepening. She was 22 years old and she was going to die in a forest in a rainstorm, and Marcus Hale would never even know he was responsible. That last thought made her so angry she started moving again. She couldn't run. She couldn't really walk. But she could move, dragging her left foot, using trees as handholds, pulling herself forward through the wet dark one tree trunk at a time. And so she moved because the alternative was sitting down and giving up, and she had decided, at approximately minute 31 of this nightmare, that she would not give Marcus Hale the satisfaction. She didn't see the light so much as she felt it. A warmth. A difference in the darkness ahead. Orange and low and flickering, the way no natural thing in a rainstorm could flicker, which meant it was made. Which meant it was a window. Which meant there was a building somewhere through the trees ahead of her, solid and lamp glow and shelter. She moved toward it the way drowning people move toward air. The cabin was bigger than she expected and darker than the single window suggested. Massive timber construction, the kind that looked like it had grown out of the ground rather than been built on it. Thick log walls, a deep pitched roof shedding waterfalls, a covered porch that groaned under her weight when she dragged herself up the 2 steps and collapsed against the door. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, louder, and the wood was so thick she wasn't sure the sound was carrying, so she made a fist and she pounded, 3 hard blows that she felt in her already screaming wrist, and then she pressed her forehead against the door and breathed and waited. The door opened. The man who opened it was enormous. Not tall in the way that seemed possible on city streets or in gym locker rooms. Tall in the way of something else entirely, something that belonged out here in these ancient trees, proportioned to a world that was bigger and older and less forgiving than the one Ivy had grown up in. He had to duck slightly under his own doorframe. His shoulders filled the opening. His beard was dark and dense and slightly overgrown, the kind that happens when a man stops keeping track of time. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and in his right hand, hanging casual and low at his side, was an axe. Not a hatchet. An axe. Full handle. Blade still holding a faint gleam. He stared at her. His eyes were dark, she couldn't make out the color in the low light, and they moved over her in a single rapid assessment. The mud, the blood on her palm, the way she was holding herself, the angle of her left foot. Taking stock. He didn't speak. Ivy opened her mouth. The words she'd been rehearsing during the last 100 yards of her terrible journey. "I'm sorry to bother you, I got lost on the trail, I need help please," dissolved somewhere between her brain and her lips. What came out instead was smaller than she intended. Barely a sound at all beneath the rain. "Help me." The darkness rushed in from the edges. And Ivy Callahan, 22 years old, running from a man who wanted to own her, fell forward into the threshold of a stranger's world. The axe hit the porch boards with a heavy, deliberate sound. 2 massive hands caught her before she hit the floor. The first thing she registered was the fire. Not the sight of it. Her eyes weren't open yet. But the feel of it, the way heat pressed against the left side of her face with the steady, patient insistence of something that had been burning for a long time and intended to keep burning. It was so far removed from the cold that had been eating into her bones out in those trees that for a long, disoriented moment she couldn't locate herself in time. She was 7 years old at her grandmother's house in Vermont. She was 16, camping with people she used to know. She was somewhere safe. Then her ankle introduced itself. The pain wasn't the screaming, acute thing it had been in the woods. Something had taken the edge off, whether medication or wrapping or simply time. But it was present and specific, and it pulled her the rest of the way into consciousness with efficient cruelty. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn timber, dark with age and wood smoke. She was lying on something firm but padded. A couch or a daybed, covered in what felt like wool blankets, plural, layered with the pragmatic generosity of someone who understood cold. To her left, the fire she'd been feeling. A proper stone hearth deep set into the wall, burning with the confident steadiness of something that had been tended and fed recently. To her right, a room. The cabin was one large space, divided by function rather than walls. She could see a kitchen, rough counters, cast iron hanging from ceiling hooks, a hand pump at the sink that suggested no running water. A workbench along the far wall covered in tools she couldn't immediately identify. A table with one chair. Bookshelves, floor to ceiling, so densely packed the spines blurred together in the firelight. And Thorne. He was standing at the kitchen counter with his back to her, doing something quiet and methodical with a pot. He'd changed, the muddy flannel replaced by a cleaner one, dark blue, still rolled at the sleeves. Without the rain and the darkness and the axe and her own terror shaping the moment, he was somehow more imposing, not less. The cabin was not a small room, and he made it feel like one. His shoulders, when he moved, shifted with the easy economy of someone who had been doing physical work his entire life and no longer needed to think about it. He didn't turn around. But his posture changed slightly, a fractional shift of his weight, a small tilt of his head, and she understood that he knew she was awake. She looked at her ankle. It was elevated on a folded blanket and wrapped in a clean bandage, tight and even, with 2 strips of what looked like flexible splinting material running along either side. It was the kind of wrap that required knowing what you were doing. She thought of her friend Dana, who was a nursing student, who had wrapped Ivy's sprained wrist after a fall in a parking garage 2 years ago and used almost exactly this technique. "Where am I?" Her voice came out rough and underused. Thorne said nothing. He moved to the hearth, lifted a cast iron pot from the hook over the fire with one hand like it weighed nothing, and brought it to the table. He ladled something into a bowl. She could smell it now, a dense, herby broth with something earthy underneath, and carried it to the small table beside her. He set it down. Then he straightened, looked at her directly, and pointed to the bowl. His eyes, in the firelight, were a dark and complicated green. "Thank you," she said, automatic. She watched his face for a response. He gave her a single nod and turned back toward the kitchen. Wait, he stopped. Who are you? What's your name? Nothing. He walked back to the counter. I'm Ivy. My name's Ivy Callahan. I was hiking the Ridgecroft Trail and I got turned around and my phone died. She heard herself talking too fast, filling silence with volume the way she always did when she was nervous. I don't want any trouble. I just need to know where I am so I can figure out how to get back to the... Is there a road? How far are we from a road? He opened a cabinet and took something down from a shelf. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He did not give any indication whatsoever that he had heard a word she said. Ivy looked at the bowl of soup. She looked at the man's back. She looked at the axe. It was standing upright just inside the front door, propped against the wall with the easy familiarity of an umbrella stand, like that was simply where an axe lived. Next to it, on a series of wooden pegs, hung 3 hunting knives and leather sheaths. The smallest was longer than her hand. The largest was, she didn't want to estimate the largest. She thought about the way the door had opened, the way he had filled the frame, the way there had been no hello, no are you alright, no basic human acknowledgement of the bleeding woman who had collapsed at his feet. No words. No sounds at all. Just those dark green eyes assessing her damage, and those enormous hands catching her before she hit the ground. Nobody lived this far from everything. Not normal people. Not people who wanted to be found. The soup smelled incredible. She was being irrational, she told herself. He had bandaged her ankle. He had carried her inside. She must have been carried, she couldn't have walked. And covered her with blankets and made her soup, and she was warm when an hour ago she had been accepting the real possibility that she would not see morning. A person doing all of those things was not doing them in order to hurt her. That was not the logic of a predator. Unless, said the small cold voice that Marcus had planted in the back of her mind like a seed 6 months ago, that's exactly how a predator would want you to think. She moved the blankets, sat up slowly, gritting her teeth against the pulse of pain from her ankle. Found the floor with her right foot, told herself that if she could just stand she could assess the situation more clearly, she could see the door from a standing position and gauge the distance and decide. She stood. For approximately 1.5 seconds. Then her ankle buckled and her right knee followed and she was going down again, and she had just enough time to think not the floor, please not the floor again before something stopped her. 2 hands. One at her back, one at her arm, taking her weight with such practiced steadiness it barely looked like effort. He had crossed the room in the time it had taken her to fall, which should have been frightening, should have been another data point in the case she was building against him. But she didn't hit the floor and she didn't hit him, and when she looked up he was simply there, already lowering her back down to the couch like a man returning something fragile to its proper shelf. He shook his head. Just once. A slow, clear, unambiguous no. Not commanding. Not threatening. The way you might shake your head at a child reaching for a hot stove. Not in anger but in the simple quiet certainty that you know something they don't yet about the nature of heat. His eyes held hers for a moment. They were, she thought, the kindest eyes she had ever seen on a face that frightening. He stopped trying to understand it. He picked up the soup. The storm did not relent. By the second morning Ivy had stopped expecting it to. The rain had settled into something with permanence and intention. Not the dramatic lightning-cracked downpour of the first night but a steadier, more committed thing. A gray curtain hung across every window that showed no interest in being drawn back. She could hear it on the roof constantly, a low continuous percussion that she slowly stopped registering the way you stop registering the sound of your own heartbeat. Thorne went outside anyway. This baffled her, initially. The first time she watched him pull on a heavy canvas jacket, lift the axe from its place by the door, and walk out into the downpour without any apparent acknowledgement that the weather was a factor, she assumed he'd be back in 10 minutes. He was back in 90, soaked to the collar, carrying an armful of split wood that he stacked by the hearth with the methodical efficiency of a man completing a task he'd completed 10,000 times before. He didn't seem cold. He didn't seem bothered. He hung his jacket on a peg, changed his shirt with his back to her and began making breakfast. That was the rhythm of it. That was Thorne. She spent the first full day cataloging him the way she might catalog a foreign country, trying to understand the customs, the geography, the unspoken rules. He woke before she did, always. The fire was already burning when she opened her eyes each morning, the cabin already holding a warmth he had built for both of them without being asked. He cooked 3 times a day, Simple, competent food from stores that suggested long and careful planning, dried beans and cured meat and root vegetables, and once, on the second evening, a dark bread he mixed and baked himself in a covered cast-iron pot buried in coals. He moved through the cabin's routines the way water moves through a familiar landscape, without hesitation, without waste, finding the easiest and most direct path every time. He carved. This was what he did in the evenings, in the single chair angled toward the fire, and it was what made her stop being afraid of his hands. He would take a piece of wood, sometimes pale birch, sometimes something darker she couldn't identify, and a small knife, not one of the hunting blades from the door pegs but a delicate thing with a short curved blade, and he would work. Not quickly. Not with any apparent urgency. Just steadily, patiently, turning the wood in his left hand while the right made small, precise movements that accumulated over the course of an hour into shapes. A bird mid-flight, a curved leaf, once the suggestion of a fox's face emerging from a piece of gnarly root as if it had always been in there and he was simply finding it. She watched him more than she intended to. On the third day, the creek Thorne had shown her through the east window, gesturing toward it in response to her question about roads, then shaking his head to indicate no passage, had risen to consume its own banks and was spreading brown and fast through the low ground between the cabin and whatever lay beyond. She'd understood then with full clarity that she was not leaving in any immediate sense, and she'd had a private, undignified moment of panic in the corner of the room while Thorne was outside that she was not proud of and did not intend to repeat. She was stuck. She was stuck, and her phone was dead and no one knew where she was. The notebook appeared on the table beside her soup bowl on the third evening. It was small, the cover worn smooth and dark at the corners with years of handling, the kind of notebook that had clearly been used and refilled many times. He'd put a short pencil beside it, sharpened to a clean point. She looked up at him. He was already turning back toward the fire, settling into his chair, picking up the piece of birch he'd been working the night before. She opened it. The inside cover was blank. She turned to the first page. He had written in a careful, deliberate hand, the letters small and even. "You are safe. Rest." She read it twice. Then she picked up the pencil. "How long have you lived here?" She wrote and turned the notebook toward him. He looked at it. Looked at her. Then he rose from his chair, took the notebook, read it, and wrote something below her question before returning it. "Long enough." She almost smiled. "Are you always this chatty?" A pause while he read it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of the concept. He wrote, "Yes." And something loosened in Ivy's chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched. She wrote for a long time after that. Not questions, she'd run out of easy ones and the harder ones still frightened her. But the thing she hadn't said out loud to anyone in 6 months because saying it out loud made it more real than she could manage. She wrote about Marcus. She wrote about how they dated for 4 months and she'd thought he was attentive until she'd understood that attentive and watchful were different words for the same behavior depending on whether you wanted to be seen. She wrote about the texts, escalating in both frequency and temperature. The time she'd found him parked outside her building at 2 in the morning, and his explanation had been so reasonable, so warm, so plausible that she'd almost believed it. The time she'd found her spare key missing from her kitchen drawer. She wrote, "I drove 3 states because he knows my car, so I borrowed my friend's and I left at 4 a.m. and I still didn't feel far enough. I thought the mountains would be far enough. I thought if I crossed the state line he'd feel like more of an abstraction. I thought distance was the same thing as safety. I was stupid." She stopped writing. The fire popped. The rain continued its patient work on the roof. The notebook came back across the table. One line. Not stupid. Running toward something, not away. She looked up. Thorne was already looking at her. Not with the assessing, cataloging gaze of those first hours, but with something she recognized from the faces of people who had lived through their own bad chapters and came out the other side knowing what real trouble looked like. His jaw was set. There was something moving in his expression that wasn't quite anger. Or rather, it was anger, but it was the contained kind, the kind that has learned to sit still and has become more dangerous for the learning. He was furious on her behalf. This man who had not spoken a single word was furious for her, and the absurdity and the kindness of it hit her somewhere low in the sternum and stayed there. She realized, sitting with that warmth pressing against her left side and this strange, silent, enormous man sitting across from her in the firelight, that she could not currently hear her own heartbeat over the sound of the rain. That her shoulders were somewhere they were supposed to be, down and back and unbraced for impact. that she had not checked the window in almost 2 hours. In 6 months she had not felt safe in a room with another person for 2 consecutive hours. She wrote one last thing before she closed the notebook. "Thank you for the soup." He read it, set the notebook down, picked up his piece of birch, and went back to the quiet work of making something out of raw material. She found them on the 4th day. Thorne had gone out earlier than usual. The rain had eased overnight into something thinner and less committed, and she'd watched him from the window as he disappeared into the tree line with a coil of rope over one shoulder and the particular purposeful stride of a man who had already decided what the morning required of him. He'd been gone 20 minutes. She'd eaten the oatmeal he'd left warming on the hearth, washed her bowl in the basin, and then done what she'd been quietly, guiltily wanting to do since the first morning she'd been well enough to sit up and look around properly. He went to the bookshelves. They covered the entire east wall floor to ceiling, and they were the most fully realized thing in the cabin. More finished, more inhabited than anything else in the space, including the man who lived here. Everything else was functional. The furniture was sturdy and plain, the kitchen organized for efficiency, the tools arranged by use. But the books were kept. Not just stored but tended to, their spines facing outward with care, grouped in some system she couldn't immediately decode that seemed to combine subject and size and possibly something more personal, more intuitive. Literature alongside field medicine alongside wilderness botany alongside. On one low shelf, a long row of what looked like technical forestry manuals worn to soft exhaustion at the spines. She ran her finger along the titles slowly. A man's reading life laid out in one long line. She thought you could know a person entirely from their shelves if you knew how to look. She was reaching for a collection of Neruda, because she was surprised by it, because it was unexpected and therefore interesting, because a man who read Neruda in a cabin in the mountains was not the same man as the one her fear had briefly constructed, when something fell out. A folded piece of paper. Then another. She caught them before they hit the floor, and when she unfolded the first one she saw the gray and white grain of old newsprint, the small dense columns of a local paper, and a headline that stopped her completely. Volunteer praised for rescue efforts in Colton Ridge fire. One still missing. She looked at the door. Still closed. She read. The fire had been 10 years ago, late October, a farmhouse outside a small mountain town called Colton Ridge. It had started in the early hours of the morning, cause later determined to be a fault in the wood stove flue, old construction, dry timber, the kind of disaster that required only the right combination of ordinary factors and a single moment of bad luck. A man identified as a local resident, the name partially obscured by a fold crease, only though visible, had been the first on scene and had gone into the burning structure twice before emergency services arrived, pulling a neighbor's child out on the first entry. The second entry he had not come out quickly. He had come out eventually. Without the person he'd gone in for. She unfolded the second clipping. This one was dated 3 weeks later. Smaller. A follow-up piece with the tired, obligatory energy of a story a town wanted finished. The headline read, "Community mourns AS investigation concludes." She found his name in the third paragraph, fully intact this time. Thorne Calloway, 25, husband of the deceased, was treated and released for severe smoke inhalation and injuries to his throat and vocal cords sustained during rescue attempts. He has not made a public statement. She read that sentence twice. Injuries to his throat and vocal cords sustained during rescue attempts. She thought about the sounds he didn't make. He thought about the notebook. She thought about a 25-year-old man going into a burning building screaming for someone who didn't come back out with him, screaming until his voice tore itself apart trying, and then coming to a place like this and never trying to use what was left of it again. She thought about 10 years of chosen silence as both consequence and penance. We are about to discover why Thorne never speaks. But first, a note from your narrator. If this story is finding something in you, if Thorne and Ivy feel like people worth staying with, please subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of story reach the people who need it most. Now, back to the cabin. The door opened. She didn't have time to put the clippings back. She turned, and Thorne was already inside, already shrugging off his jacket, already halfway through the automatic sequence of return, and then he saw her. Saw what was in her hands. Saw her face, which she could feel was doing something complicated and probably transparent. He went completely still. The rope coil dropped from his shoulder to the floor and he didn't appear to notice. He stood in the open doorway with the pale morning light behind him and looked at the clippings in her hands with an expression she had no single word for. Shame was part of it, and something rawer beneath the shame, the particular exposure of a person who has kept one room locked for so long they've half convinced themselves the room doesn't exist anymore. His jaw tightened. He looked away. He was going to leave. She could see it in the shift of his weight, the way he'd already begun turning back toward the door and the uncomplicated mercy of the trees. He would walk out and give them both time for this to become something that had happened and been absorbed and could be left alone. She crossed the room before she'd decided to. Her ankle held, barely, still tender but functional enough, and she covered the distance between them in the time it took him to reach for the door, and she put herself between him and the outside in a way that was not quite blocking him but was clearly asking him to stop. He stopped. He was looking over her head at the middle distance, the deliberate unfocusing of a person who has decided not to be present in their own face. She reached up. Her hand found his throat gently, not grasping, not pressing, just resting against the side of his neck where the old damage lived, where 10 years of silence had its address. He felt him go rigid. She felt him breathe. "It wasn't your fault," she said. The words were quiet. She meant them the way you only mean something when you've read the truth of it rather than been told it, when you've found evidence rather than received a narrative. She meant them as plainly and completely as she could. His face didn't change. And then it did. Slowly, the way ice changes in early spring, not breaking but shifting, something structural giving way in increments too small to name individually but impossible to miss in aggregate. His eyes, when they finally came down to meet hers, were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the morning light coming through the open door behind him. He didn't make a sound, but his shoulders dropped and his head bowed forward slightly, and the tears that ran into his beard were entirely silent. The grief of a man who had lost even the ordinary language of crying, and Ivy stood in front of him with her hand still against his throat and let him have it, all of it, a decade of it, without looking away. Something shifted after that morning. Not dramatically. Not in the way of movie moments where a revelation restructures everything at once and two people emerge from a single conversation transformed. It was quieter than that. More like the way a room changes when you open a window, not new furniture, not new walls, just air moving differently through the same space. Thorne was still Thorne. Contained, deliberate, economical with everything including expression. Ivy was still Ivy. Prone to filling silence with words. Prone to watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. Prone to cataloging details the way anxious people catalog exits. But the distance between them had a different quality now. It had been a wall before. Now it was simply space. Space that either of them could cross without the crossing meaning something threatening. He started leaving the notebook on the table between them like a standing invitation rather than a specific offering, open to a fresh page, pencil beside it, the way you might leave a door ajar. He wrote in it constantly. He wrote back less frequently but more carefully, his responses short and considered in the way of someone who had learned to spend words the way you spend something finite and valuable. She asked him one morning what his favorite book on the shelf was and he thought about it for a long time before writing a single word. Changes. She didn't understand until she looked and found the shelf wasn't organized by subject or size or personal attachment, but by the order in which the books had changed him. She didn't tell him that this was one of the most heartbreaking and beautiful things she'd ever encountered. She just wrote, "That's a good system." He wrote back, "It takes revision." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The rain finally relented on the fifth morning, not gone entirely but pulled back to an intermittent drizzle that felt almost polite by comparison, and Thorne indicated with a tilt of his head and a raised eyebrow that she could come outside if she wanted to. He wanted to. She borrowed one of his heavy flannel shirts over her own because her jacket was still damp, and she didn't miss the way his expression registered this without comment. Something quiet moving through his eyes before he turned toward the tree line. He taught her to move quietly in the woods. This took considerable patience on his part and produced considerable private amusement on hers, because she was, by nature and by upbringing, a person who moved through space the way cities had trained her, efficiently and without particular attention to sound. Thorne stopped her twice in the first 10 minutes with a hand on her arm and a look that communicated you are alarming everything within a quarter mile with complete clarity and 0 words. She exaggerated her next step deliberately, placing her foot down with theatrical carelessness, and the expression he gave her was so thoroughly unimpressed that she had to press her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. He showed her how to read the forest instead. How to find the edge of a bird's territory by the change in its call. How to distinguish the compressed silence that meant a predator had moved through recently from the ordinary quiet of an undisturbed morning. He would stop walking, point upward into the canopy, and wait for her to find what he was looking at. A kingfisher sitting motionless on a bare branch, a pair of nuthatches working their way down a trunk headfirst in defiance of common sense. Once a great gray owl regarding them both with the magnificent indifference of something that had been in these woods longer than either of their concerns. He watched his face when he watched the birds. It was the most open she had seen him. Not unguarded exactly, but inhabited, present in a way he wasn't always, like this was one of the few contexts in which he didn't have to manage his own expression. She carved badly. He was patient about this too. He gave her a piece of soft wood and the small curved knife and sat beside her at the table, demonstrating the angle of the blade against the grain with a slow, deliberate motion she could observe and attempt to replicate. She could not replicate it. Her attempts produced something that progressed through identifiable stages. First formless, then accidentally threatening, then something her friend Dana would have called abstract. She showed Thorne the results of 20 minutes of effort, and he looked at it for a long moment with complete seriousness before writing in the notebook. "It has character," she said. "That is an extremely kind word for what this is." He wrote, "The wood resisted you. That means something." He thought, "So do you?" "And I'm starting to think that means something too." She didn't say that part. But she thought it with increasing frequency over the days that followed. And the thinking was becoming less abstract and more specific, more detailed, more rooted in particular and observable things. The way he always positioned himself between her and the door when they heard sounds outside without appearing to do so deliberately. The way he remembered, without being asked twice, that she didn't like the dried sage he'd used in an early meal, and quietly stopped using it. The way he listened, God, the way he listened with his whole body, with a quality of attention she had never once received from anyone she'd dated, from Marcus who had listened only for the information he needed, from the others before Marcus who had been kind enough but were always partially elsewhere. Thorne was never elsewhere. When she spoke he was entirely, completely there. The fire had burned low on the 7th evening. The drizzle tapped quietly at the dark windows. Ivy had been reading one of his books taken from the shelf with his permission, a collection of short stories by an author she'd never tried. And Thorne had been working on a new carving, something larger this time, the shape not yet emerged from the wood. She looked up and found him already looking at her. This happened sometimes now. The looking. She had stopped pretending it was accidental on either side. He set the carving down. She set the book down. The fire made its small sounds between them, and outside the rain continued its patient, indifferent work, and the space between the couch and the chair was not a large space, not more than 3 feet of warm air, and somehow it had never seemed so specifically relevant as a measurement before this moment. He leaned forward. His elbows went to his knees. His eyes moved over her face with the same slow, careful attention he gave the wood before he began, reading the grain, looking for where it wanted to go. She felt her breath adjust without her permission. The distance between them became 2 feet. Then less. She could see the texture of his beard, the old scar along his jaw she'd noticed days ago and hadn't asked about yet, the way his dark green eyes were doing something complicated and unresolved. His hand moved, lifted slightly from his knee a fraction of an inch before stopping. He pulled back. Slowly. Deliberately. He picked up the carving and looked at it instead of her, and his jaw set in the way she'd come to recognize as him deciding something privately and not inviting comment. She understood the decision without needing it written down. She could see it clearly in the way he held himself afterward. The slight forward hunch, the deliberate reinvestment of attention in the wood. The posture of a man stepping back from the edge of something he'd decided he didn't have the right to want. She was trying to find the right words for the notebook. Something that would reach him without frightening him, without pushing, something that understood the shape of the silence he was hiding inside. When the knock came. Not a knock. A pounding. 3 blows on the heavy door, aggressive and rhythmless. The knock of someone not asking but demanding. The knock of someone who had decided before their fist met the wood what the answer was going to be. Ivy's blood went cold. Thorne was on his feet before the 3rd blow finished. Thorne was already moving. Not frantically. Nothing Thorne did was frantic, she was learning. But with a sudden, decisive shift from stillness to motion that covered the distance between his chair and the door in 4 steps. He didn't reach for the door. He positioned himself in front of it, slightly to the left, and turned back to look at her with an expression that asked a direct question without any ambiguity whatsoever. "Do you know who that is?" Ivy had risen from the couch without remembering standing. She was against the far wall, her back to the bookshelves, and she could feel her heart doing something loud and structural against her ribs. The pounding came again. 3 more blows, harder this time, the door shuddering faintly in its frame. And the sound of it moved through her body the way sound only moves through you when it's been specifically trained to produce that response. 6 months of conditioning. 6 months of that particular rhythm meaning danger, danger, Danger. That's him, she whispered. The words were barely sound. But Thorne was watching her face, not the door, and he read it there before she finished saying it. Something happened in his expression. Not fear, nothing close to fear, something almost opposite to fear. A settling, a consolidation, a man taking the full measure of a situation and deciding where he stands in it. Literally and otherwise. He turned to the door pegs. Took the axe. Not with urgency. With the same matter-of-fact ease with which he did everything. The same ease with which he'd carried the firewood and lifted the cast iron and caught Ivy's falling weight without apparent effort. He held it at his side, blade down, not raised, not threatening in its angle, but present. And ambiguous. He looked at Ivy and pointed to the space directly behind him. She crossed the room and stood there. The back of his shoulder was approximately level with her face. She could feel the warmth coming off him even through the flannel, and she pressed close enough that she could feel him breathing. Slow, steady, a man who had made a decision and was now simply waiting to act on it. Outside a voice. She hadn't heard Marcus's voice in 3 weeks and had spent a portion of every day since hoping never to hear it again. And it arrived now through the heavy door, slightly muffled but completely recognizable. That particular register, the tone he used when he wanted something and had already decided that wanting it was sufficient justification. Ivy. I know you're in there. I found your friend's car at the trailhead. Pause. The theatrical patience of someone performing reasonableness. Come on, babe. You've made your point. This is insane, you've been out here for a week, just open the door and we'll go home. She pressed closer to Thorne's back. His posture didn't change. I'm not playing games. The reasonable tone thinning now, the way it always did when it wasn't immediately effective. Like a coating that required regular maintenance. Open the door, Ivy. I drove 9 hours. Open the door. Thorne reached out and threw the bolt. The door opened inward and Marcus Hale came with it, having apparently been leaning his weight against the frame in anticipation, stumbling slightly before catching himself and straightening with the quick, reflexive vanity of someone who can't stand to look off balance for even a moment. He was exactly as she remembered and somehow less. Or not less, but reduced, in the way things from your past sometimes reduce themselves when you encounter them in a new context. He was a good-looking man in his late 20s, gym-built and well-dressed even now. Even after 9 hours of driving and trail hiking, the kind of person who managed their appearance like infrastructure. He looked around the cabin with sharp, evaluating eyes. Then he looked at Thorne. There was a beat, a single brief moment, in which Marcus took in the full reality of what was standing between him and the room. The height, the breadth, the beard, the axe held loose and low at the end of one enormous arm. The complete, unnerving stillness of a man who was not performing composure but simply had it. Then Marcus laughed. It was a specific kind of laugh. The social laugh of a man who has decided that laughing first gives him control of how something is categorized. By laughing he was categorizing Thorne. Placing him. Deciding what he was and what he wasn't and therefore what threat level he occupied and what tone was appropriate for managing him. Okay. He spread his hands. A gesture of expansive, performative reason. His eyes were already moving past Thorne to the interior of the cabin, looking for Ivy, finding her, fixing on her with an expression that he probably believed looked like relief. There she is. There you are. Back to Thorne, the smile still in place, slightly harder at the edges now. Listen, buddy. I don't know what she told you, but this is between me and my girlfriend. Nobody needs any trouble here. Just... a gesture toward the axe, indulgent like a man humoring an overgrown child. Put that down and step aside. Thorne didn't move. Marcus's smile dropped a fraction of a degree. Give me the girl, freak. Thorne stepped forward. One step. That was all. One single, unhurried step that nonetheless completely altered the geometry of the doorway, filling it, consuming it, making it simply an extension of Thorne rather than an opening that a man might pass through. He didn't raise the axe. He didn't change his expression. He looked at Marcus Hale with the dark green eyes of a man who had lived alone in an ancient forest for 10 years and had therefore lost any residual concern for what other men thought of him, and he said nothing because he never said anything and the silence was enormous. Marcus stopped laughing. Marcus's hand went to his jacket. Ivy saw it before it happened. The particular micro-movement of a man reaching for something he'd been thinking about reaching for since before he knocked on the door. The decision already made, the action merely delayed until the moment required it. She'd spent 6 months learning to read Marcus Hale's body before his body announced itself. And she read it now with the terrible clarity of someone who had paid for that knowledge in increments she couldn't get back. Thorne. The knife was already out. Not large. A folding blade for inches maybe, the kind of knife sold in sporting goods stores and carried by men who want the option without the commitment of something larger. Marcus held it the way men hold weapons they've never actually used. With too much deliberateness, the grip slightly wrong, the angle performative rather than functional. But 4 inches of blade in a small cabin was not a theoretical problem. He pointed it past Thorne. At Ivy. She walks out with me. His voice had shed the last remnants of the reasonable man register. What was underneath was smaller and uglier, the voice she'd heard twice before in small enclosed spaces. His car, her apartment hallway. When the performance had dropped completely and what remained was just the demand, stripped of any pretense of being something other than what it was. Right now. She walks out and we're done here, nobody gets hurt. Thorne looked at the knife. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, with that complete, unhurried attention that processed information at its own pace and answered to nothing, and then he set the axe against the wall. Marcus's shoulders dropped slightly with satisfaction. Thorne crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took the knife hand at the wrist. What happened in the next several seconds was not a fight in any cinematic sense. There was no exchange of blows, no circling, none of the choreography that the word fight implied. Thorne simply redirected Marcus's wrist in a direction a wrist was not designed to travel, with a controlled application of force that suggested training or experience or both. And Marcus made a short, high sound that was not quite a word and the knife hit the floorboards. Then Marcus swung with his free hand, a wild, hooking blow that had the full weight of his body behind it and connected solidly with the side of Thorne's face. Thorne's head moved slightly to the left. He looked back at Marcus with the same expression. Then he took hold of Marcus's jacket at the collar and walked him backward into the wall with a measured, inexorable force, the way you might move furniture, and held him there. His forearm across Marcus's chest, his feet planted, his breathing unchanged. Marcus was a fit man in his late 20s and he was being held against rough timber logs by the straightforward application of another man's gravity, his feet finding no useful purchase, his hands working at Thorne's arm with the increasingly frantic quality of something that has understood it is outclassed and has not yet accepted this. Get off me. Thorne waited. He waited until the struggling reached its peak and began to exhaust itself, the way you wait out weather, and when Marcus had subsided into something more manageable, breathing hard, jaw tight with humiliation, the knife on the floor between them both untouchable and unforgotten, Thorne stepped back and let him find his feet. Marcus straightened his jacket. His eyes went to the knife, then to Thorne, then performed the rapid internal calculation of a man determining what his options actually were. He looked briefly like what he was. A man who had come a long way to collect something that was not his, and had found an obstacle he hadn't planned for, and was now rearranging his face into something that could survive the loss of this round without losing the narrative. His eyes moved to Ivy. This is what you want. He gestured at the cabin, at Thorne, with the expansive contempt of someone who believes contempt is a valid closing argument. This? You're hiding in the woods with this. What is he, some kind of hermit? Some kind of animal? His voice found a new gear, the one she recognized as the final stage before he left a room. Loud enough to feel like power, cruel enough to feel like it had cost him nothing. He can't even talk. Does he understand what I'm saying right now? Does anything go on behind those eyes? A short, vicious laugh. You left everything to run to a mute animal in the woods. He can't give you anything. He can't even say your name. He reached down and picked up the knife. She is mine. The word landed in the room and stayed there, and Ivy watched Thorne's back and she saw the moment it moved through him. Not like impact but like ignition, something catching from the inside, spreading upward through his spine, through his shoulders, into the base of his skull. She saw his hands close. Close again. She saw him breathe. She saw him decide. The sound that came out of Thorne was not a word yet. It was the thing before a word. A sound from the floor of a man, from the deepest and least managed chamber, something that had been locked in a burning room for 10 years and had found, in this specific and intolerable moment, that the lock had limits. It scraped up through damaged tissue and disused architecture and came out raw and enormous and completely without precedent in the life of anyone standing in that room, including Thorne himself. And then, a fraction of a second behind the sound, the words. 3 of them. Not loud in the way of shouting. Louder than that, past the category of loud entirely, the volume of something geological, something that the cabin's timber walls received and held like struck bells. Leave her alone. The silence that followed was absolute. Ivy's hand was at her mouth. She could not have said when it had gotten there. Thorne stood in the center of the room with his chest heaving and his eyes wide, and his expression the expression of a man who has just heard his own voice for the first time in 10 years and does not yet know what to do with what he has discovered. That it was still there, that it had survived, that the fire had not taken everything. Marcus Hale looked at the man in front of him, and for the first time in the entire encounter, something moved in his face that was not calculation or contempt or performance. It was fear. Clean and simple and unmanaged. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at Ivy again. He took 3 steps backward through the open door, missed the porch step, caught himself, and then he was moving down the path into the dark tree line, the sound of his crashing progress through the underbrush diminishing rapidly and then swallowed entirely by the forest and the night. The door stood open. Rain-washed air moved through the cabin. Thorne had not moved. He was looking at something in the middle distance that was not the door or the room or the darkness outside. Looking inward, maybe, at the strange new landscape of a self that had just shifted on its axis. His hands were open at his sides. His breathing was slowing. Ivy crossed the room and stood in front of him. She didn't touch him yet. She just waited, the way he had taught her to wait in the woods, still and present and making no demands on the moment. He looked down at her. His voice, when it came again, quieter now, barely above a whisper, rough and broken and entirely real, formed the only word it needed to. Ivy. The first thing he did was reach for his throat. Not dramatically. It wasn't a gesture of triumph or anguish, just the reflexive, assessing movement of a man taking stock of damage, the same way he might press a hand to a cut to gauge the bleeding. His fingers found the side of his neck and stayed there, and Ivy watched his face as he processed whatever he felt. The rawness she imagined, the torn and scraped sensation of structures pressed into service after a decade of disuse, like opening a door that had been sealed shut so long the frame had warped around it. He coughed. Once, then again, then a sustained and wrenching series that bent him forward slightly at the waist, his hands still at his throat, his shoulders working. It was the cough of something cellular and involuntary, his body responding to what he'd asked of it with the honest and unceremonious accounting of a system that kept no sentimentality about the costs of things. Ivy was there before she'd decided to move. Her hand found his back between his shoulder blades and she felt each cough move through him like weather, and she held her palm flat and steady against his spine and waited it out with him because that was what you did, that was the only useful thing, being present and still while someone else moved through something difficult. He had taught her that without meaning to, over 7 days of watching him do exactly that for her. The coughing eased. He straightened. His eyes were watering, from the coughing, from the physical strain of it, and he blinked it clear, and when his gaze came down to find hers she saw the full complexity of what was happening in him. The pain, which was real and visible, and underneath the pain something else, something that had not been there before tonight, a quality of openness she didn't have a cleaner word for. Like a window that had always been painted shut and had just been forced finally by the right combination of pressure and necessity. You spoke. Her own voice was unsteady. She hadn't cried during the confrontation, had been too frightened, too focused, the animal brain routing all available resource to vigilance. But she felt the tears now, arriving late and somewhat overwhelming, the delayed invoice of the last 20 minutes. You spoke, Thorne. You. She stopped because he was looking at her in a way that made words feel imprecise. He opened his mouth. She watched him decide, watched the deliberate, almost visible gathering of will, the choice to spend something costly again so soon after the first time, when the spending had already hurt him. His voice, when it came, was barely a voice at all. More texture than sound, rough ground and fractured, like something reconstituting itself from raw material. I couldn't. A pause. His hand tightened slightly against his throat. Couldn't let him take you. The simplicity of it. She had spent 6 months surrounded by men who spoke constantly and said nothing, who used words as instruments of navigation and control and performance. Marcus most fluently, but not only Marcus, a whole city's worth of noise that filled every available space without ever quite communicating anything true. And this man, for whom speech was pain, for whom speech was cost, had spent his voice on I couldn't let him take you and said everything. Thorne. She said his name the way he had said hers. Quietly, the single word carrying the weight of what didn't need to be spoken around it. She reached up. Her hand found his jaw, his beard rough and warm against her palm, and she felt him exhale. A long, slow release. A man setting something down that he'd been carrying without realizing how long he'd been carrying it. His forehead dropped to hers. They stood like that for a moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same small air, the fire burning its patient commentary behind them and the forest pressing its dark quiet against all the windows. This time he didn't pull back. His hand came up to her face. Careful the way he was careful with the small carving knife, with the birds in the canopy, with every small and valuable thing he demonstrated he understood how to handle. And then he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It had the quality of his woodwork. The result of a man who had been thinking about the shape of something for a long time and knew, when he finally reached for it, exactly where to put his hands. She felt it in her sternum, in her knees, in the specific place behind her ribs where she'd been quietly carrying the weight of being afraid for 6 months. She felt that weight simply put itself down. She kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally separated, his eyes were open and close and doing something entirely new. Present in a way they hadn't been before, even in all their days of careful closeness, like a man who has stepped fully into a room he'd been standing in the doorway of. She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, but it came out of her, warm and uncontrolled and genuine. His mouth curved in response. A real smile, the full version, the one she'd been catching fragments of for days. And it rearranged his face entirely into something that made her understand completely why it had been so carefully kept. They found evidence of Marcus's flight in the morning. Thorne tracked it quietly and came back to the cabin and wrote in the notebook. He ran south. Hit the service road. Gone. Below that, the road is passable now. She read it twice. Looked up. He had a second line ready when she met his eyes. He turned the notebook so she could read it. You don't have to leave yet. She thought about Portland. Her apartment, her job, her ordinary life with its ordinary noise. The specific texture of a city that had stopped feeling safe months ago. She thought about how safety, it turned out, was not a geography. Not a distance covered or a state line crossed. It was something you found or didn't find in particular company, in particular silences, in the specific way a person positioned themselves between you and a door without making a performance of it. He took the pencil. I know, she wrote. She underlined it once. 1 year. Ivy measured it not by calendar but by the things that had changed in the way you measure the growth of something living. Incrementally, incompletely, looking up one day and realizing the evidence had been accumulating while you weren't watching. The curtains, for instance. She'd made them herself from fabric ordered online and delivered to the postal box in town. Heavy linen in a warm cream color that caught the morning light coming through the east windows and held it, distributed it gently across the cabin's interior in a way that made the whole space feel inhabited rather than occupied. Thorne had watched her hang them with an expression of genuine bafflement at the concept of curtains as a priority, and she had explained at some length the difference between a space you lived in and a space you simply lived at, and he had listened with his complete and characteristic attention and then written in the notebook. They still kept the notebook, though it served a different function now, less urgent necessity and more comfortable habit. I understand the theory. The execution confuses me. She'd kissed him on the cheek and gone back to hemming. The flowers were hers too. Dried bundles of lavender and yarrow hung from 2 of the ceiling hooks she'd liberated from tool duty. And a clay pot on the windowsill held a succession of whatever was blooming seasonally, currently a spray of late autumn asters in a particular shade of purple that she found satisfied something specific in her. Thorne had brought them in from the tree line without being asked, setting them on the table beside her coffee one morning with no ceremony. And when she'd looked up at him, he'd simply returned to the stove as though the gesture required no acknowledgement. She had acknowledged it extensively. He'd pretended to find this disproportionate. He was not convincing. He hummed while he worked now. This was the thing she hadn't anticipated, hadn't known to anticipate, because she hadn't known it was a thing he'd been before. Before the fire, before the silence, before 10 years of existing in a register that nothing could access. Not a melody exactly. Something looser and more shapeless. A low sound from the back of his throat that accompanied the rhythm of his hands on wood the way running water accompanies its own movement. Not trying to be music, simply being sound because something in him had remembered after a long time that it could. She heard it from wherever she was in the cabin and it rearranged something in her chest every single time. His voice had healed slowly and partially and in its own idiosyncratic way, the way injuries healed in people who didn't make accommodations for being injured, stubbornly on its own schedule, arriving at a functional state that was not quite what it had been before but was genuinely and entirely its own thing. He spoke in short sentences mostly. He spoke when he had something to say, which she had discovered was a more generous frequency than it might sound. He said her name with a particular inflection that she was fairly confident she could have picked out of any crowd on earth. He told her, approximately once a week in slightly different configurations of very simple words, that she had changed the specific gravity of his world. He didn't phrase it that way. He would have found that phrasing excessive. What he said most recently, standing at the workbench with sawdust in his beard and his eyes on the piece of oak he was shaping into the side panel of a cabinet for a couple in town who'd seen the bookcase and asked to commission something. "It's better. This. All of it." She'd said, "I know." He'd said, "Good." That was a full and complete conversation between them and contained everything necessary. The woodworking had grown organically, the way things grew in this forest, without a plan, rooted in existing conditions, finding its shape in response to available light. Word had spread through the nearest town that there was a man in the mountains whose work was extraordinary, and the commissions had arrived tentatively at first, then with more confidence, and Ivy had found herself managing the correspondence and the logistics with an organizational fluency that surprised her until she remembered that she had always been competent. She had simply, for a period, been competent while frightened, which obscured the former under the weight of the latter. She was not frightened anymore. Marcus had not resurfaced. There had been a period, 3 months during which she'd checked the treeline too frequently and startled at sounds outside the cabin and woken from dreams that required Thorne's arm across her and his steady breathing beneath her ear to dissolve. He had offered all of this without being asked and without making her feel surveilled by his attention, which was, she had come to understand, the essential difference between being watched and being seen. The dreams had stopped. In their place, ordinary mornings, coffee on the hearth while Thorne worked, the sound of his tools on wood filling the cabin with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat by now, familiar and foundational. Afternoons in the forest, where she had learned to move quietly enough that the birds no longer announced her approach. Evenings by the fire with books and the notebook and the companionable silence of two people who had made their peace with the full dimensions of each other and found those dimensions workable. More than workable. She thought, sitting on the porch on this particular late October afternoon, watching the trees hold their remaining leaves with the stubborn golden dignity of things preparing to let go. She was glad. Not despite the woods or despite the quiet or despite the particular way she had arrived here, desperate and broken-ankled and half-drowned, but inclusive of all of it. The whole improbable chain of it. Because she had learned, in this forest with this man, that safety was built from the same materials as everything else. Slowly by hand with attention to the grain. Thorne pushed the screen door open and came out to stand beside her. He looked at the trees for a moment. Then he looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence between them was full. It had the quality of all the best silences. Not an absence but a presence, not empty but inhabited. The silence of two people who had found each other at the far edge of their respective hard chapters and decided, with full knowledge of the costs, that this was where the next one started. She leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The forest held them both. If Thorne and Ivy's story found its way to something real in you, if you've ever needed to be found or needed to find someone, please like, share and leave a comment below. Let me know you were here. Type "True Love" if this story reached you. And if you want more stories about healing hearts and quiet heroes, subscribe and stay. There are more to tell.